I was hiking in the Nevada desert somewhere near Beatty. Because I'm a bored and braised Nevadan, I'm pretty comfortable and experienced in hiking by myself. So I didn't feel particularly uneasy walking around by myself. This is the only strange thing I've experienced in my 3 years of wandering around the absolute middle of nowhere. Anyway, there are a lot of small mountains and hills in the area that I was in, and a few caves too. I generally stay away from them, in case they are coyotes or something inside them. It was getting pretty late, so I was walking back down, and there's this big hill that I always pass. And at the base of the hill, there's a cave, not too big, and when I was walking past this certain hill, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that there's something blocking the cave at the bottom. So I squint, and I look at whatever I think it is, assuming it's a coyote, and it's this dude. He's crouching by the cave with his shirt off, and he hasn't seen me yet. I thought about calling out to him to see if he was okay, and whilst I'm standing there, he turns to look at me. I was thinking, oh okay, maybe he needs help with something. Maybe his dog ran into the cave or whatever. I raise my hand to start to wave, and this guy stands up really slowly, and then he charges at me. He runs quite strangely, with his hands by his sides, poking out kind of like an L shape. He's about 100 or so yards away, so I just stand there for a moment, dumbfounded, because I have no idea what he's doing. It becomes very apparent that he's not so friendly, so I haul ass out of there. I'm a thick guy, and I'm not particularly afraid of being caught, just very confused. I see the road I started on far away, and I plan to cross it and run straight into a shop or something, when the dude starts making strange noises. He's yelling in a weird, kinda tired but guttural way, and I can hear that he's slowed down and is far behind me now. He just keeps yelling these weird noises. I'm not sure if it meant anything, but after I got some distance I heard him throw a rock. I kept running until I got to town, and can still hear him yelling behind me.
About 17 or 18 years ago, my fiance, myself, and one other couple were hiking the Pyramid Point hiking trail in the Sleeping Bear Dunes of northwestern Lower Peninsula of Michigan at dusk. Now, we had an old film camera. Mine had a 200mm lens on it. We got to the overlook, which overlooks northwest over the Mantinue Passage over the Mantinue Islands. We watched the sunset and entered the late dusk period that seemed to last forever during a northern Michigan summer. It was probably 10 PM at this point. There were high winds and solid waves breaking on the shore below us. The Pyramid Overlook Point is maybe 200 feet above Lake Michigan, but it didn't look rougher than many evenings on Lake Michigan, where 5-foot breaking waves are fairly routine, with fairly high winds and crashing waves providing great noises to sleep at night. We were camping elsewhere though. There's no camping at this trail. While standing and talking, we see a light flash once, out in the water between the islands and the mainland. It's in the vicinity of North Mantilou Sol Lighthouse. We stopped and looked around, but we weren't creeped out by it. After all, boats were going up and down there fairly regularly. I grabbed my camera to look through the lens, and I found what appeared to be a small boat. It was difficult to tell with a 200mm lens. It's a 7-mile wide stretch of water, and the nearest island is probably 3 or 4 miles away from the light. We had flashlights, so we shined our light, which from several miles away might not have been very visible, especially not in the direction that we were shining it. Immediately the light came back and started flashing SOS and Morse code, which given us a huge surprise. We weren't even sure if our lights were bright enough to be seen at that distance. Given how rough the waves were too, we really didn't expect it. We were just a little spot several miles away. Now we are suddenly full of adrenaline and concern. Two of us actually ran back towards the car, which was half a mile through the woods in the dark down a hill with our flashlight, and we got a cell phone and binoculars. While we're gone, the folks on the lookout had no light source. At the car, we called the Coast Guard from our cell phones. It was a 98 or 99, so there weren't any smartphones by any stretch of the imagination. We explained to the Coast Guard that somebody was flashing SOS at us in the water, and that we were just the hikers who actually managed to see it, and that our observing point was from Pyramid Overlook. They said they'd send a ship out ASAP to check the area, and we asked them to hurry. At this point, we ran back to the overlook with binoculars and our phone and our flashlight. Atop the overlook there was no signal, so we had to pocket the phone and try and do our best to communicate with the Coast Guard. With our binoculars we were able to see a guy in a tiny aluminium boat. It's rowing like crazy with the waves raking over his boat. It was nearly pitch black out, so we're only barely able to make it out. This is maybe at 11 by this point, and during Michigan summer it's still light enough to see while outside. He would occasionally turn around, flash an SOS at us and go back to rowing. It's truly disturbing to know that we were several miles away and we could only helplessly watch this guy struggling. It got dark and we couldn't see anything anymore. Every few minutes a man in the boat would flash the SOS at us. He didn't appear to be making any progress though. He was clearly drifting northward though, away from us. Every time he'd flash, we'd turn on our flashlight and shine it back at him for a few seconds and turn it off. We don't know Morse code and we had no signal. We stood there and watched him for what felt like an eternity. The man then stopped flashing his light. It was too dark to see his boat now. There was actually a tugboat. That didn't appear to be a Coast Guard ship. It did show up and started doing a grid search pattern through the passage with the bright lights shining around on the water. The passage is probably 6 or 7 miles wide and 6 or 7 miles long. It was going to be a slow search. A smallish Coast Guard ship actually showed up doing searches at the northern end, doing straights with also bright lights. They eventually met in the middle, doing a zigzag type pattern which felt like an eternity. They sailed off though, and they didn't appear to have found anyone. We drove to a bar just to see if there was anything on the news. There wasn't. We called the Coast Guard the next day, wondering if they'd seen the man, or maybe he passed, but the only person on duty had no idea what happened. To this day, it's so unsettling to know that we have no idea what happened to that man, knowing that we'd seen a man flashing SOS at us through binoculars just before it got dark, and that was the last we ever saw of him. I have no closure. I just hope that he's okay.
I was hiking alone, out in the Flindland Ranges in Australia, and started to set up camp by an empty creek of pebbles, which was softer and cool, unlike the surrounding terrain. Once it got dark, I saw a light from a torch pass through my tent, and decided to get out to see who it was. About 20 meters away, there was an old man in rugged clothes, with weird dent things in his hat. I greeted him, but he didn't reply and continued to walk towards me. At this point, I'm completely baffled and freaked out and decide to run. I don't know why, but something wasn't right about the whole situation. But as I started gaining distance, he began to chase me down. As the Flinders is a really open terrain, I couldn't hide, so I climbed up a mountain and hid behind a collection of boulders and observed him, walking around the mountains as if he were waiting for me to come down. This went on for a couple of hours before he left. I have no idea what his motives were or where he came from, but I decided to hike back to the nearest town and go back to Adelaide after that.
This isn't my story, but my father's. Now my father used to have a business in maintaining the woods. It's a thing in my country. It basically means cutting down dead trees and hauling them out of the area. This meant that he was out in the woods all day, and he was usually allowed in places that normal people weren't allowed to go, as ruled by a forestry commission. My dad was working in the early morning when he suddenly noticed a car in the middle of the woods. It drove through a small path, normally only used by foresters. It wasn't a car from the commission, so he thought it was very weird that it was there. However, my dad was alone, and in the 80s, he didn't have a phone or anything, so he wasn't able to contact anyone. Since it is in the middle of nowhere, he had to ignore it. He kept on hauling wood through the woods with his horse when he suddenly heard men speaking. Now, my dad is a brave man and strong as a bear, so he just decided to take a quick peek to see what the hell was going on. As my dad was able to look through the thick brushes, he could see the men. They were digging a hole. My father decided that something was wrong with this and he didn't want to interrupt them, and decided that he would keep working throughout the day like nothing ever happened. He made sure to keep some distance between them and the site he was at. The men apparently never even noticed my dad was there, possibly because his equipment wasn't located in the direction the men come from, and that my father worked with horses, so they're not very loud. It was the 80s after all. At the end of the day, my father got to the local commission area and reported it. They called the police. They then found the body of a young woman recently buried there.
I used to work for Noranda Explorations as a geologist assistant in Canada, Northwest Territories. Once I was out with a geologist in a two-man camp right by a lakeside that would travel the area by Zodiac. We were approaching our campsite around 3 PM one afternoon, and we could see our sleeping tents were trashed. The area was filled with black bears, and we obviously scared one away. It was strange as it didn't touch our meat pit or our kitchen tent. We were forced to sleep in the kitchen tent, and there was one open food, just canned goods. We crawled into our sleeping bags, and around 10 PM, I was just drifting off to sleep when we heard a branch snap, and my partner's mutt began to growl. We picked up the rifle, went outside the tent, and were greeted by a very large black bear that abruptly turned tail and ran. We ended up moving our camp the next morning to an island, but had to work in the very same area, and just played on your mind that you'd come across a bear sign, and there were times I would be alone with only a K-bar and spray for protection. I could never shake the feeling of being watched. We had 2 other camps going on that weekend. One camp had to shoot 3 bears. 2 were shot at their meat pit before the others began hightailing it. They shot that one too, as it would only come back. The other camp was on an island not far from land, and a bear made its way out there. The geologist shot it, but only wounded it, as it was a very dicey situation before he was finally able to kill it. I worked 2 years and never had a summer like that before. Like I said, I became very paranoid and anxious about working alone, and called it quits after the job was finished.
I was camping with my family and friends up in the mountains. I was sharing a tent with my brother, we'll just call him Luke, and another friend that we'll just call Evan. Luke, Evan and I weren't tired when everybody else retreated to the tents for the night. The fire was dimming out and we were so bored that we retreated inside our tent to watch Adventure Time on my laptop till it died. We passed out after a few episodes and I woke up sometime during the night with an episode of sleep paralysis. I have weird habits and experience sleep paralysis every few months or so. For those of you who haven't had it, it's basically where you cannot move when you wake up. You sometimes experience auditory and visual hallucinations. I was aware of this, and that's why I didn't have a full-on heart attack when I started hearing noises outside my tent. which did actually continue and got louder and louder until the fabric of the tent itself was being touched by something. My computer hadn't yet died, so I could see my surroundings in the dim light of the screen. I watched the fabric compress as something touched against me, and it sporadically did so about 4 feet off the ground. Then it moved around the tent towards me. I watched 3 distinct impressions and followed this creature around the side of the tent. It looked like a claw. I was terrified and filled with adrenaline, but another part of me remained calm, assuring my body that it was just a dream. I mean, I literally couldn't do anything about it, so fear was absolutely useless. As I continued to observe it, my paralysis began to fade and I realised I could move. I was convinced I was no longer dreaming, so I reached over and shoved Luke awake. I tried to get him to look and see if there really was something, but it must have sounded like I was sleep talking because he rolled over and went back to sleep. Eventually, the rustling stopped. I was tired and groggy enough to fall back asleep. In the morning, I'd completely forgotten about it. That is, until my brother-in-law, who was in the other tent, I'll call him Dean, said to us, "It's a good thing that we put the dog in the car last night. There was a bear here while we were sleeping." Dean then pointed to the tree where we'd hung up our trash, so that way animals couldn't get to it, and there were fresh gaping claw marks about 9 feet up the trunk. It then hit me like a truck. I had seen the bear and calmly watched it rip through some of the fabric of my tent, only about 10 inches away from my face.
So this batch of new recruits are a week into their enlistment, and one guy wants to win the Best Recruit Award, and is trying his best to shine at every opportunity possible, bootlicking included. So it was past midnight in the wee hours of the morning, and the recruit is somehow awoken from his sleep. His bed is right next to the window. He begins to hear footsteps coming from outside the window, drawing nearer. He sees an older man in uniform walk past the window. His face he has never seen before. Assuming it was the duty office manager making his rounds in camp, in his grogginess, but still wanting to look good in front of commanders, he sits up and greets the man. "Good morning, sir." The officer stops in his tracks, turns around, looks at him, and says, "Good morning, soldier. It's still early, go back to sleep." The recruit smiles and says, "Thank you, sir," and lies back down to sleep. Only, at that moment, did the recruit realize something. His bed is beside a window, and his bunk is on the 4th floor. There is no way a man could have been walking outside the window, 4 stories up, in mid-air. Who exactly was outside his window?
A lot of creepiness and happenings in the area are blamed on the so-called rainbow people. According to legend, they're a group of virgin hippies who started a simple living cult in the 70s or 80s. They went off into the woods and basically never come out. More colourful tellings say that the years of isolation and hippie weird stuff they do has warped their minds. The police in small mountain towns like Nalanda and Ward acknowledge the existence of small groups of people who may or may not be these folks, and warn that they should be considered dangerous. Apparently, they wander around breaking into remote cabins for food and supplies and take any drugs they can get their hands on. A close friend has a pretty creepy story about an encounter with a rainbow person. He was living in his father's house, a cabin off the grid near Nederland. They got no running water, plumbing, heat or electricity, etc. He had a room on the ground floor with a bed directly underneath a large glass sliding door that directly faced thick woods. One night, he was awoken by the sound of something tapping at the glass. He checked his watch and it was around midnight. He was half asleep and blamed it on the wind and without looking, rolled back over to go to bed. Later, he's awoken again. He says that it's about an hour later to the exact same tap-in. He now realises that something's up. There's no wind tonight and the trees are dead still. Suddenly, he grabs a handgun by his bed, sits up and turns to look. No more than 5 feet from him, on the other side of the glass, is a frail, hairy, dirty, ghastly looking man with tattered clothes and bloodshot eyes, staring right at him. With the sight of his gun, this guy scampers back into the woods, but apparently he'd been standing there, tapping and staring for at least an hour.
I had been out stargazing and was sleeping out in a park near a town. No tent, just a sleeping bag and pad. This was a fairly popular area for joggers and walkers, and I had found a nice spot in a field, a few hundred meters from the top, obscured by tall grass and bush, but with a nice view of the valley below and mountains in the distance. It was very nice, and I saw some shooting stars, heard coyotes singing in the distance, and slept very well since it was a warm summer night. In the morning at the crack of dawn, I was woken up by one of the strangest performances I've ever witnessed. Above me on the hill, I could hear some kind of chanting. Due to my concealed location, I couldn't actually see what was going on, and I wasn't keen on moving to a better vantage point, lest to be seen by the group. A man's loud and deep voice was half chanting, half shouting in a language I couldn't identify. It sounded like Latin, and it was definitely not Spanish, although he kept repeating a word which sounded similar to Diablo, Spanish for the devil. There were other voices too, but he was clearly leading whatever was happening up there. Eventually he finished his chant, and there were some cheers and whoops, and then the entire group silently departed. After waiting a while to make sure I was clear, I went up there to where the sound had came from, and there was no physical evidence of whatever had happened. I asked everybody I knew in town if they had any idea of what it might have possibly been, and nobody had heard of anything like it. To this day, it's one of my greatest regrets not peeking out of my hiding spot and see what the heck was going on.
I'm not convinced that there's an afterlife or such things as ghosts or demons for that matter, but I once saw something in the woods that felt so unnatural it made me second guess how I see the world. I was hiking up a hillside with thick trees everywhere in the middle of the night during a long weekend. Some friends and I decided that we would hike to the top of the hill and let off some fireworks. Approaching the hill and surrounded by the base of the hill was a high rolling grass valley. It was around midnight, so it was full of the moonlight and the mist. It was like something out of a horror movie. The strange part is, I wasn't nervous or scared or anything. I was having a great night with my buddies. I didn't have any of my defences up. My buddies and I just hiked in a straight line through the rolling grass valley, approaching the hill. Suddenly though, something caught my eye. To my immediate right, I saw a tall, shadowy figure standing perfectly upright on the top of a small grassy hill. It was standing there right next to a large dead tree. Now I couldn't make out any details. Both the tree and the tall figure was silhouetted under the moonlight. The strange part was seeing this figure and that it didn't scare me. I didn't immediately sense any threat. I almost assumed that it might have been another hiker. I passively turned my flashlight on and that's when it happened. In an instant, as my light hit the spot where the figure was standing, it instantly moved just outside of the range of my flashlight, like it teleported or something. But just as vividly as I saw it standing in its initial spot, as my flashlight hit it, the figure moved again, and I could see it standing just outside the range of my light again. My breath paused. In an instant wave of dread, something felt 100% unnatural about what just happened. As a reflex, I moved my light to a new spot where the figure was, and just as my light passed it, It disappeared. I've never passed out in my entire life, not from heat, not from getting knocked out, never. But in that moment, I felt my knees give way under me and I just fell. My friends then turned and looked at me and just watched me trying to pick myself up, and my knees were probably too wobbly to stand. They helped me as I tried to explain what I'd experienced. Now, I've literally never been able to explain the sensation that I felt. It was like I just witnessed something that no human should see, so unnatural that my body's instinct was just to go limp.
Varmint control for ranchers with free-range cattle. About 2 hours south of Tuscan, in the Sky Island. I arrived and parked my vehicle at the mouth of a small canyon and set up a shelter about 10 feet away. Approximately 1 hour before sunset, I made dinner and chatted on CB with other hunters and set up my area. At the time, I heard noises from the canyon. At the mouth, you could see 15 feet in, and then it took a sharp right. The walls were about 12 feet high, but I heard the noise, and it sounded like it came from way deeper in the canyon. It was a repetitive clacking noise, like someone had 2 sticks and kept hitting them together. It did not stop. At least I fell asleep to the noise, with my rifle at my side. I woke up at 4 AM sharp, had some breakfast and got ready to head out. I locked my truck and clubbed the steering wheel and was off. I walked about 3 miles from the mountain, found a high hill, and it was covered in white quartz rock. It had massive veins of mica and was definitely a sight to behold. By the time I arrived to the hill, the sun was up and the coyotes were yapping. I called and called and laid there motionless for 2 hours. Nothing. I watched a small bug crawl on my scope and fly away. And that's when I noticed movement about 270 yards away. It was a single coyote, diseased. I zeroed in on it and noticed its funny walk. It walked leading with its right shoulder, and its head bobbed up and down a little bit too much. I figured I'd put the poor thing out of its misery. I took aim and squeezed. It connected and it went down. I walked to collect the animal, and I walked to the spot, and I didn't see it. I swear that's where it fell, 3 yards from the sideways barrel cactus. I saw no blood and no trail, just silence. I knew I watched it go down. I saw it. I searched for 30 minutes and saw nothing that led me to the animal. Well, there just went my $40. I called it a day and was getting a little warm and my arms were sore from the rifle. So I hoofed it back, slowly, in case I ran into the bed of my truck. I was set facing into the maw of the canyon, dead center of the entrance, in the shade of the walls, and that's when I heard it again, the clacking. This time it sounded closer, as if it were right behind the bend of the canyon, as if whatever it was doing was hiding right behind the turn. I didn't dare grab my chair. It was $10 at the swap and meet, and I thought about firing around into the canyon, but figured that it wouldn't do much. I rolled up my tent, keeping a sharp eye on the canyon, and at this point the clacking would stop. Each time I stopped what I was doing to watch and listen. When I would go back to loading my truck, it would start right back up. I packed my tent, tossed it in the bed, grabbed my lantern and my propane stove, and put them in the bed as well. I put my rifle away, and I still had my 1911 at my hip, but I didn't feel safe. I jumped in my truck and started it. I watched the canyon. Nothing. Not a sound. Just the low rumble from the cold started truck. I let her run a bit and warm up. At this time, the canyon was filled with sunlight as it was noonish, and I felt a sense of bravery, and I wanted to take a quick peep around the bend of the canyon. So I let my truck run, grabbed my pistol, and I approached the canyon. I stood at the mouth, listening for any shuffling, clacking. But there was nothing. It was bright from the sun, and I led with my gun. I stood about 5 feet away from the bend, unsure what was waiting on the other side. I thought to myself to just grab the chair and book it, but I needed to know. I leaned in slowly around the corner and saw nothing. It went about 20 feet in and then a dead end. I did notice animal tracks, hoof marks and coyote tracks. I didn't notice any animals during my stay, and these prints looked fresh. I stood at the corner facing down at the dead end. 2 very smooth rocks lay at my feet. They did not look of the region. They were light red, smooth, as if they were from the rivers. I turned away, grabbed my chair and drove off. I felt as though I was being watched. I swear there were eyes on me, and they knew that I knew. I felt like a game, like they were the mouse and I was the cat. However, I wouldn't chase. Now I've encountered relics of Native American tribes in the area. Old clay pots, napped tools, smooth stones to grind grain on. But I had thought the tribes were long gone. I spoke to a good friend, a fellow called Hugh. His last name was Huerta. He came from the lines of tribe members. His mother and his grandparents 100% Pascua blood. His father was Mixtec, and he spoke of the medicine men that would curse animals and was said to be shapeshifters, evil beings that were turned the wrong way from the magic. He said what I had experienced was from one of the spirits playing games to get me away from their lands. He said he'll have his abuelo pray for me and that I should stay the night at his parents' house, and was blessed so that I would be safe. And so I did. So a few weeks later, me and my friend Hugh had a day on our schedule where we were both free and had time. We made the day to head out to the spot and maybe look for clues or see if the rocks were still there. Hugh said his elders would disapprove of this because it attracts bad spirits when one messes with them. He felt like the area needed closure, that a prayer would maybe cleanse the spot of the evil. So we made a lunch, loaded some supplies, and headed out around 2:30 a.m. We arrived just as soon as the sky began to lighten up. It was still dark, but to the east the sky was waking up. I drove and stopped the truck about 300 yards away from the canyon. It was silent in the desert. Not even a cricket was chirping. No birds were singing. No coyotes were laughing. It was dead quiet, and we were being watched, Hugh said. We are not of the area, and they all know it. He had his way of speaking in riddles, and he was very poetic in his words. No wonder he had trouble getting dates. We hiked to the area, and we arrived at the campsite. My firing was still there, and there were animal tracks going in a circle of the fire ring, as if the animals were dancing around the ring. It was almost too perfect to be planned. I was scared, and Hugh seemed at peace. I watched his face, and I felt safe with him. At this point, there was a light, but the sun was still hiding behind the mountains to the east. It was still quiet. Hugh made his way to the canyon and stood at the mouth and looked on it. He had a smaller leather pouch with him. It had herbs and some local plant life deemed medicinal by his people. He tied the pouch to a saguaro rib and rested the staff at the edge of the canyon at the mouth of whatever it was, home. He spoke in a tongue I didn't know, and he sat in the dirt. He prayed. He stood up and raised his arms to the sky. I felt lighter after that. I felt as though this fog was lifted, and almost immediately I heard birds and crickets. It may have been the sun rising, but to me, it seemed like his prayer shooed the fog away. It seems almost fairy tale what happened that morning, but my parents have told me that Native American magic is not something to play with. That they themselves have experienced weird things going on when they travel in Native American lands. My father is Christian to the max, but he still believes that evil lurks with the corrupted native spirits. It may be that we live in the Southwest and we grew up with those stories, but I'm not sure. Hugh was struck with a nasty flu 2 days after the encounter. He was bedridden for a week. I visited him every day. I was told he was being attacked by the spirit for intruding on its territory. It was flu season, but still it seemed very well timed. He was treated with herbs and prayers, and I chalked it up to him having a badass immune system. But I digress. He tells me to this day that we should have never have gotten to the area challenging whatever it was. That was a force beyond us, and we can't do anything about it. His family tells me not to return to that spot, that the evil will follow me, that it will remember my face, and they prayed so that it may forget it.
It was the middle of the night in Sierra Nevadas, California. We're inside the debris hut with my dad. We'd hiked about 6 miles in the beginning of the archery hunt, the deer hunt. We get awoken by this blood-curdling scream at around 2 AM outside our hut. We could only make out a partial shadow through the leaves and twigs. The only way I can describe it is like a really furry horse, but standing on 2 legs. The death sound went on for about 3 minutes and we're truly freaking out, trying to get armed and ready. Suddenly though, there is silence. We spent the rest of the night wide awake. The next morning, there's no trace, no footprints, or tracks in the dirt. There's literally nothing. Nothing where it was standing, nothing nowhere near us. Nine years ago, I was camping in northern BC with a group of friends. It was around 10 PM and we're in the middle of nowhere, roughly 50 kilometers away from the nearest town. It was super dark outside. We were sitting around our fire and just listening to tunes and drinking beers, etc. At one point, we see a light up on the mountain across the lake from us. Now this was a decent sized lake. I'd say roughly 5 kilometers across and surrounded by mountains. So as we noticed the light, assuming that it's other campers that wanted us to visit them, we flashed our flashlight and attempted to communicate. First, we flashed our light twice. They flashed back at us twice, then 3 times. We were brainstorming about going for a hike to go and meet them when the light suddenly increased in intensity, then proceeded to fly off from one side of the massive mountain to the other and one side of the lake to the other. It then sat there and flashed at us a few more times, but we turned off our light and we were absolutely terrified. I just remembered how scared I felt going into my tent and putting my sleeping bag over my head, just out of pure fear. I fell asleep and was awoken and everything was fine, but for some reason, there was roughly half a dozen dead, really big toads outside my tent. What the hell? I still wonder what happened to this day.
My uncle owns land in Zion Ponderosa Ranch in Utah. So the 4 of us went to go camp there for my birthday weekend. Zion Ponderosa Ranch is kind of like a camping community in the woods. There's a bunch of families there, and they all know each other and it's a pretty friendly place. Everyone knows who owns what part of the land and stuff. Whilst we're camping, this average hillbilly looking dude came to introduce himself to us. He told us his name was Brian, and that he was staying up in the road in the cabin, and that he was staying up the road in a cabin. Nothing too weird, so we welcomed him and gave him a couple of beers and fed the dude some tacos. A friend of ours, called Tim, who owns the land next to ours, came over to hang out. Tim knows everyone around, but has never seen this person before. This time, Brian introduces himself to Tim as Justin, maybe a middle name. Then the mystery dude excuses himself to feed his neighbor's cat, and leaves on his ATV like a bat out of hell, and comes back in 5 minutes completely drenched wet. We didn't ask any questions, and in the 5 minutes that this dude was gone, another neighboring family came over and asked, since we were hanging out with the guy, if we could tell him to be more careful, since the family had children running around, which was completely understandable. The dude then comes back, and we tell him about the family concerns, and that his driving could be a danger to the children. "Screw the kids. Who the hell are the kids to tell me what to do?" replies the weirdo. That was more than we were comfortable with, so we politely asked him to leave because he was drinking a lot and he had a gun. And we didn't know the guy anyway. We were already uncomfortable. He apologizes and leaves back to his cabin or whatever. And less than a minute later we hear gunshots coming from his direction. We all kind of freak out a bit, and guess who comes back to greet us? The same dude, trying to apologize, as we ask him about the gunshots, and he replied, So you heard gunshots? So what?" At this point my girlfriend was getting really frightened by this guy, so we decided to use my uncle's ATV for a ride. Whilst leaving, my uncle spoke to the dude. I blocked out their convo, but I definitely heard him say that he needs to take the Hitler stance on the subject, so they wouldn't walk all over them and destroy the country. When we got back, the dude was gone, and we went to sleep for the night. At 4 AM, I was woken up by the sound of an ATV coming very close to our camp, and stopped there for a while, before going back the same direction he came from. I'm 90% sure it was from the direction of the crazy dude's cabin, and in the morning, we went to the office administrators to warn about the weird guy, and no one seemed to know about him. Fortunately, we never saw him again after that, but it still creeps me out, the danger that we were in with him being nearby.
I was 13 at my grandfather's hunting camp. My uncle had just bought a new camera to hunt with and wanted to go and test it out, so he set it up out in the woods. I got the brilliant idea to go up in the woods with 2 of my other cousins and moon it, so when he checked the card, instead of wildlife, he would have seen some lovely butt cheeks. Hilarious to a 13-year-old's mind. After some convincing, my other 2 cousins were in, but we had to go under the cover of darkness. So we set our alarms for 3 AM and pass out. By 3:15, we're all sneaking outside, throw on our headlamps and start walking. We know the camera is about a mile away. The trail goes over 2 pretty big hills. The camera is in the valley on the far side of the second hill. We started walking as normal. Everything's good. The excitement starts building and we're pretty giddy about what we're about to pull off. After a few minutes of brisk walking, we get to the top of the second hill. Now my older cousin, who has much better knowledge of the area, stops as he gets to the very peak of the hill. I make my way to the top. I then see why. Off in the distance, about 400 yards away, is a spotlight. It's bluish and white colour. The thing actually illuminated half of the hill it's pointed at. It's crazy bright. My cousin actually tells us that we gotta turn off our headlamps just so we can see it better. All 3 of us are now staring in absolute amazement. We stand there in silence. I actually started to get freaked out though. Aliens is the first thing that comes to my head. I tell my oldest cousin that we have to leave. I turn on my headlamp and turn around, about to head back to the campsite. As I turn my headlight back on, the super bright blue light starts to slowly turn and stops right on us. No bobbing or movement, just extremely slow and smoothly, and it does a consistent pan right over our area, just inching as slowly as possible. At that point, we note the hell out of there, with my cousin right behind. I get inside and go straight to bed, pretty much freaking out. Flash forward to the next morning. All three of us go back to the same spot and then proceed to go to where we thought the light was. Now there's no boot marks, no light, nothing. To this day, I still have no idea what the hell that was.
Not me, but my parents. They went camping on their honeymoon 20 years ago. They went to the Garden of the Gods. This is in hick country, southern Illinois, where everyone is related. But they're walking in the trails, and they stumble upon a dead body. Thinking it was a joke, they'd walk over and immediately realize that this is in fact a real dead body. My mother pushes my dad over to get the hell out of there. They go to town, which is about 25 minutes away, and tell the police chief there. He thinks they're just messing with them, since they're both young, about 18 and 19, and he finally decides to check it out after they've been hounding him. They get there, and it turns out that the man was laying there dead for the past 4 days.
This was maybe 7 or 8 years ago when I was 20 and messed me up in a really bad way. I've been messing up my life because of drug use for the past year, but after lots of help and love from friends and family, I was getting my head cleared. Almost there. Above the black tar hell that I got myself into, I decided to get out of the city and drove 2 hours out to a smaller town in Missouri, where Google Maps told me to go to a small campsite and there was water by it. I knew there shouldn't be very many campers there because how cold it was. It was about 40 or so at night. So I'm almost there. I'm driving down a picturesque 2-lane straight highway. It's very misty this morning, and I see that there's something lying in the road about half a mile up. Just as I slow down to approach it, I see it's a shaggy dog, just hanging out. I stopped and rolled down my window right next to it. She come up and licked my hand and wagged her tail a bit. She seemed to expect something from me. She had no tag, no tattoo for Chip. It was just a dog with no name. Naturally, I opened the passenger side door and she hopped in. So now I got this dirty family companion with me, the dog with no name. The entrance to the campsite was only half a mile further, and as I suspected, there was nobody around. I just gone and put money into the donation pot. I gone and chose a site really close to the stream. I set up my tent, the same one that I'd been using for years as a kid. I collected some dry sticks and started a fire. The dog with no name just circled around the campsite. It was just sniffing leaves and whatnot. I went to check out the rivulet about 30 feet wide. It was man-made and there was a stone that you could walk across. The west end was a lot deeper though, sort of pulling at the dam, maybe an 8-foot drop into the calmer streams. Instantly, I wanted to go on, cleanse myself and maybe baptize myself. I grew up in a Catholic church, so I just thought why not? The dog sees me scoping it out and he's just watching me from the campsite. Now I can't bring myself to go down though. I'm hugely disappointed. It's cold and I don't really want to get cold and I don't have a towel, but I wanted to get baptized, but I had to give up on the idea. So I go back and get some cigarettes, eat hot dogs with my dog, still with no name. Night falls quickly after this. I meditate a bit and I roll inside the tent to sleep. My buddy sleeps inside the tent next to the sleeping bag. This dog was awesome, and I still couldn't call it a name. Now I woke up for some reason that I can't put my finger on. Now the main source of heat for me was that dog, but it's missing now. I quickly jump out of the tent, and there she is, just sitting waiting for me in the pitch black, wagging her tail. It's very strange. It felt like somebody or something is telling me to get back down into the river and do the same thing. We walk down the short trail together, shrouded by darkness. It's even colder than before, but I start to drip away, standing on the chilly stones of the dam. The dog with no name just sits on the edge of the river staring at me. Now, I'm just staring into the pitch black inkiness. I should mention that I hate swimming, especially when I can't see the bottom of where I'm swimming. Now my fearful imagination takes over and I freak out. So I stand on that dam forever, not sure what to do. I just think screw it and dive in. It was cold as hell. It was scary as hell. When I come up in the air, I was thrashing wildly towards the dam, stumbling to get back on the stones. I shook out my hair and to my surprise, the adrenaline helped me keep warm. As I pick up my clothes and shoes, I look over for my buddy at the river's edge. The dog is nowhere in sight. Back up at the campsite, I'm looking around, gently whistling. I am more awoken now, so I go ahead and start another fire. It's just as it's starting to break dawn. I have another hot dog for breakfast and I figured that she'll just come back. Now the trip feels complete. As I start my car up, I check my phone. There's an hour time difference between the two. This happens to fall on daylight saving time. So I'm not calling this a supernatural rip in time, but it's funny how things went down. The exact time it would have been was around 3 AM to 4 when the dog disappeared, and that dog never showed up again. I'm not too big into the spirit world, but I honestly think that that dog must have been there to help me. And what are the chances of a dog randomly showing up in the road in literally the middle of nowhere? And how did it disappear from my sight within a second without a trace? Why did it not come back for food? I don't know, I just find it all weird. I've been camping my whole life. It's what I did for fun a lot of the time growing up. Thankfully, I found a wife who's also into this, and we've done tons of backpacking and camping together. A few years ago, we're in the middle of nowhere in Maine backpacking in the day, and then we just walk off the trail into the woods to go for a sleep. We're carrying about 10 days worth of supplies with us deep into the woods. Now we haven't seen another person for literally days. That's our goal though, to get away from it all. Normally I like to sleep under the stars, but it was drizzling a little bit, so we set up our tiny 2-person tent and went to sleep. At around sunrise, I wake up and am sitting outside of the tent putting on my boots while my wife is still asleep. About 30 feet from our tent in the middle of nowhere, this dude is just staring at me. He was right out of the central casting for Creepy Dude Who Murders Campers. I said something stupid like, "Good morning, please don't eat us." He then stares at us and just disappears. We went out there for another 4 days and I kept waiting for him to jump out and try and kill us. I still have no clue how this dude found us or what his deal was. I mean literally, this guy had no equipment on him and he was literally in the middle of nowhere. It makes no sense how he was there, and I still don't know what his intentions were.
I had a strange experience driving between LA and Las Vegas, like some of these stories. I was driving on a long, 2-lane road leading to a highway with my brother, and we were the only ones on the road for several minutes at a time. Someone would come from the opposite direction every 15 or 25 minutes. It was pitch black, except for a meager amount of crescent moonlight, just enough to see the silhouette of the hills and mountains around, when we noticed that a car is speeding up from behind. That's fine, I'm not in a rush, and with this approaching car's rate of speed, I was happy to let him pass me. I hate worrying about tailgaters, but when it gets to about 1/4 mile from us, it kept pace with us perfectly. We'd bend around a mountain, and the lights would go away for a few seconds and then reappear. We'd go up a slope, and down an incline, and it would fade and reappear. I immediately got suspicious, and squint a little harder into my rearview mirror. There was nothing below the lights touch the road. No wheels, nothing. The lights seemed to be connected, like two orbs connected by thin arcs of electricity. I noticed my brother looking at it too, and I just mutter, "Does that look like..." I couldn't really form a good sentence at this point, and he nods at me, and we laugh nervously, not knowing what else to do. After what felt like an eternity, it just stops in the middle of the road and slowly fades into the distance. We never really spoke about it since, but I think I need to call him up to confirm we saw the exact same thing.
I want to say a massive thank you to my friend Ft.MortisMedia for featuring on this video. Make sure you go and check out his channel and subscribe to him. We also have the second half to our collaboration up on his channel that are also 20 wood stories. Make sure you go and check it out. I hope you all enjoyed this video and have a great day. Take care, my insomniacs.